They opened a coffin. Because of the dog, you won't believe what they found. The wind blew among the cemetery trees, lightly stirring the dry leaves that covered the old tombstones. The atmosphere was heavy with grief, for this was the funeral of James, a police officer beloved by everyone in the unit. At least that's what they all believed up to that moment. A deep silence hovered, broken only by a few muffled sobs and the scraping of a shovel against the damp earth. The pastor, a middle-aged man with a sympathetic expression, recited words of farewell while James's family and fellow officers stood around the coffin, downcast. Max, the police dog who had belonged to James, stayed close to Sergeant Ryan, head lowered. He seemed calm at first, as though sensing the collective pain. Suddenly, without warning, Max perked up his ears and began sniffing the air, showing clear signs of agitation. It took only seconds for his barking to echo through the cemetery with growing intensity. A sense of unease washed over everyone, because Max, such a disciplined animal, never acted like that during ceremonies. A murmur rippled among those present. Some looked at each other in confusion, others discreetly wiped away their tears. The pastor stopped speaking. Max's bark was insistent, almost desperate, as though he were trying to alert them about something extremely important. He started pulling on his leash, scraping the soil around the coffin, leaving deep marks in the wet earth. Sergeant Ryan held the leash tightly, fearing the dog might injure himself or disrupt the service. But Max seemed to have a clear purpose. His paws dug fervently, scattering small clods of dirt. Standing a few yards away, the commander frowned. He knew Max well enough to understand that this was not mere anxiety. The dog was renowned for his intelligence and keen sense of smell. In difficult missions, he always sensed danger before anyone else. Why then was he behaving so erratically at a funeral? What exactly was Max trying to say? Max's restlessness spread to those nearby, generating a silent clamor for answers. Some family members were outraged by the disturbance of the funeral ritual, while others closer to James and Max felt that something truly was amiss. The dog's barks were not just noise, they were a voice demanding attention. And at that moment, even without words, Max seemed to say, "We stop everything, there's a mistake here." Max's desperate barks that day were just another chapter in the story of loyalty he had built alongside James. When Max first arrived at the battalion, he was just a timid dog, a victim of abandonment and abuse. His wary eyes and scars revealed a painful past. James, who always had a soft spot for animals in vulnerable situations, felt an instant connection with that dark-furred dog with the deeply expressive gaze. Though Max showed signs of trauma, James believed that with patience and proper training, the dog could become a valuable ally in police operations. The adaptation process wasn't simple. In the beginning, Max was startled by loud noises, trembled around strangers, and even backed away when he saw a uniform. Still, James never gave up. He spent hours each day, both on and off duty, talking to Max, petting him and showing him that the dark times of the past were behind him. Gradually, Max began responding to basic commands. He learned to sit, lie down, fetch objects, and distinguish specific scents, all thanks to James's persistence and affection. Over the months, their bond grew stronger. James noticed that the dog had above-average intelligence for detecting illegal substances, as well as a natural gift for tracking missing people. Max's early assignments in the battalion focused on searching for drugs in suspicious vehicles. In every operation, Max acted with impeccable discipline. When he found something, he gave very specific alerts, such as sitting by the suspect area or lightly scraping his paw on the spot where the substance was hidden. Max's accuracy prevented human agents from taking unnecessary risks because the dog's simple indication was enough to proceed with a thorough search. With each successful mission, Max's prestige grew, and so did James's pride. However, police life wasn't limited to anti-crime operations. Sometimes Max had to help with rescues, whether locating people buried by landslides or victims lost in dense forested areas. In all these scenarios, the dog showed an almost superhuman instinct. He would run, sniff, and upon sensing that he was close to the missing person, bark loudly to alert the search team. Accounts of Max's bravery spread to other units, and he soon became a subject of studies on advanced dog training. Even with all the fame, he remained James's most faithful partner. Often the two were seen in the battalion's corridors during off hours, simply playing with a tennis ball or walking around. That genuine friendship transcended a work relationship. In everyone's eyes, James and Max seemed like an unstoppable duo, willing to face any challenge. It was this unbreakable bond that made the police present at the funeral realize that Max's behavior that day was more than just emotional distress. There was a reason for it. Even though no one was sure what it was, they knew the dog wouldn't bark like that without a very strong motive. Max's track record, his achievements on the job, and his sensitivity in picking up signals that humans missed were enough to plant a collective doubt. Were they burying the right person? The commander, an experienced man, with many years on the force and emotional scars from battling crime, tried to maintain composure. Still, it was hard to ignore what was happening before his eyes. Max would not calm down, despite Ryan's attempts to pull on the leash and offer soothing words. Everyone there knew of the dog's impeccable record. There was no doubt that something very serious was going on. After a few minutes of indecision, the commander looked at Sergeant Ryan and spoke in a low, firm tone. "We need to open the coffin." The words were nearly inaudible to most of those present, but they reached the ears of several people nearby, whose eyes widened immediately. Was this decision madness, or the only way to clarify Max's behavior? Tension rose. Some family members were instantly outraged, seeing the opening of the coffin as disrespectful. The widow, whose expression blended grief and confusion, couldn't even react. She had seen James's body in the hospital, or at least she believed so, because her husband's face was entirely disfigured by the injuries from his last mission. Even so, she trusted that it was indeed her spouse. On the other hand, many of the police at the funeral supported the commander's idea. For them, Max's loyalty could not be underestimated. Sergeant Ryan, aware of the gravity of the matter, tried to reassure everyone, explaining that this wasn't a disrespectful act toward the deceased, but rather a necessary verification. After all, given so many missions and so many cases where Max had sniffed out clues that saved lives, ignoring this alert would be irresponsible. He also tried to justify the decision to those who questioned it, citing the dog's flawless track record. The order to open the coffin was given. A trembling cemetery employee approached to begin. The pastor, who watched on with a shocked expression, said a brief prayer as if apologizing to the deceased for such an unexpected act. The commander stood by the coffin, asking onlookers to step back and give them space. The air felt heavy. Each breath was like a dense gust filling their lungs. Meanwhile, Max, heart pounding, growled quietly, as if he wanted to help, but didn't know how. The dog would not calm down. For him, every second of delay was an affront to the truth he was trying to reveal. Finally, the coffin was unlocked and the lid began to open. The wood creaked, its sound magnified by the eerie stillness of the setting. All eyes were fixed on the opening gap, and tension reached its peak. At this crucial moment, everyone held their breath. Whatever was inside that coffin couldn't be good. Still, none of them imagined the impact the discovery would have. As soon as the lid was fully lifted, shock rippled through the crowd. The body lying there, surrounded by wilted flowers and the unmistakable scent of farewell, was not James. The surprise was so great that a few people let out muffled screams. The widow fainted upon realizing it wasn't her husband. The closest relatives rushed to help her. The silence that had dominated the ceremony was now replaced by a tumult of voices, each trying to understand how this could have happened. Out of the cries of shock and indignation arose the inevitable question: if the body wasn't James, then where was the real James? Even the commander, who had suggested opening the coffin, staggered at the revelation. He had to steady himself against a nearby cemetery railing to keep from falling. He looked at Sergeant Ryan with a horrified expression, as though asking, how could this be possible? Ryan, equally stunned, tried to maintain composure to plan the next steps. Soon some recognized the body. It was another officer from the same mission in which James had supposedly died. This man too had been reported killed, but he hadn't received the same media attention. Somehow, the bodies were confused or switched, and funeral arrangements proceeded under the assumption that the body was James's. When an officer loses his life in the line of duty, identification is often difficult because of severe injuries, and the family relies on official reports or DNA tests. But now all those protocols seemed to have failed. Amid the commotion, Max began tugging on his leash again. However, this time his focus was no longer on the coffin, but rather on a police car parked near the cemetery gates. He barked incessantly, looking at Ryan as if to say, "Let's go. We've discovered this isn't James, now we need to find him." The dog's behavior snapped Ryan out of his daze. He felt compelled to follow Max wherever he intended to go. Some people were still processing the shock of the body swap. Terrified, the cemetery employee dropped his tools and kept apologizing, saying he was only following orders. The pastor, confused, prayed under his breath. The officers, meanwhile, were already thinking about the next step, finding James. If the body in the coffin wasn't his, it meant James could still be alive or at the very least missing. Surrounded by unanswered questions, Ryan told the commander he urgently needed to make calls and gather all the information from the hospital where James had been treated. The commander, still shaken, went to speak with the family, promising that the police would get to the bottom of this. Meanwhile, Max kept barking and pulling on the leash toward the car, as though impatient to leave. Ryan got the message and decided not to waste any more time. In the police car, Ryan tried to stay calm. He grabbed his phone and dialed the number for the hospital where James had supposedly died. Max, in the back seat, pressed his nose against the window, staring at the cemetery disappearing behind them. The dog looked anxious and determined. He was tense, but also relieved that they were finally heading in the right direction. The hospital receptionist's voice came through the line. Ryan quickly identified himself and got straight to the point. "I need information about Officer James, who was admitted after last week's operation. We were told he died, but we now have evidence that this may not be true." On the other end, there was a long pause before the person answered, "I'll check the records, sir." As Ryan waited, his mind raced. If the hospital had confirmed James's death, how could there have been such a mix-up? Was it a clerical error, confused paperwork, or was something more sinister going on? He tried to organize his thoughts without jumping to conclusions. He was aware that James's health was at stake. Perhaps he was in some ward, unable to communicate, sedated, or even in a coma. After a lengthy wait, a woman's voice returned. "Sir, there is indeed a patient named James, a police officer, who arrived in critical condition a few days ago. He's still hospitalized. According to the notes, he had no clear identification when admitted, and there was a mix-up in the records. You'll probably need to come down here right away. As per the latest information, he's not in a condition to speak. He underwent complicated surgeries and is in the ICU." Ryan paused, feeling a whirlwind of relief and distress. Relief that James was alive, distress at his grave condition. Before ending the call, the sergeant asked for more details: room number, attending physician, and thanked them. Max, sensing that Ryan had finished, perked his ears up as if to say, "Where to now?" The sergeant started the car, mentally plotting the fastest route to the hospital. His heart pounded. He needed to contact the commander and James's family, but first he wanted to verify the situation in person. In the back seat, Max kept his eyes on the window, occasionally glancing at Ryan as if anxious. At each traffic light, the dog let out small whimpers. This was no longer a mere police job. It was a race against time to correct an error that could change lives forever. The hospital was a tall building with a glass facade, busy corridors, and an air of constant urgency. Ryan hurriedly parked, aware of the curious looks from people who noticed the police dog in the vehicle. Under normal circumstances, Max wouldn't be allowed inside a hospital, but this was no normal circumstance. Leaving him behind would mean dealing with a distressed animal who needed to be with James. Undeterred, Ryan got out of the car with Max at his side and entered through automatic sliding glass doors. A security guard at reception tried to question the dog's presence, but seeing Ryan's uniform and determined expression, stepped aside. Inside, the smell of antiseptic and the bright lighting made the place feel colder. Nurses hurried here and there, people waited in wheelchairs and stretchers were pushed through corridors. Ryan approached the information desk and identified himself again. The attendant, recognizing his voice from the phone, gestured for him to follow. She led them to an elevator up to the 3rd floor, where the intensive care unit was located. All the while, Max kept his nose in the air, as though trying to pick up James's scent in every hallway. He seemed certain that he was on the right track, sometimes wagging his tail slightly in hope. On the 3rd floor, the nurse pointed to a pair of double doors, saying the attending physician was waiting inside. Ryan took a deep breath and entered, guiding Max calmly. Inside the ICU, the environment was one of extreme care. Monitors beeped, patients were surrounded by complex equipment, and healthcare professionals checked data on digital clipboards. The physician on duty, a weary-looking man wearing a lab coat stained from the day's rush, approached Ryan. He explained that James arrived in very serious condition, with multiple fractures, a traumatic brain injury, and internal perforations. At the moment, He was sedated to manage pain and facilitate recovery. As for the confusion that led everyone to believe he was dead, the doctor said there had been an identification issue at admission and that the hospital was overwhelmed, causing communication failures. Ryan listened, fighting to remain composed. Then he asked to see James. The doctor led him to an isolated bed where a blue curtain offered some privacy. Pulling the curtain aside, Ryan saw a heartbreaking scene. James lay there, his face covered in bandages, with tubes and lines attached all over his body. Machines tracked his heartbeat and oxygen levels. He looked fragile, unrecognizable. It was hard to believe this once active, fearless man was now so close to the edge of life. That's when Max let out a soft whimper, wagging his tail. He recognized James, if only by his scent and his faint presence. Carefully, Ryan allowed the dog to approach the bed. Max placed his front paws on the side of the mattress and brought his muzzle close to James's arm, gently licking a small patch of skin that wasn't covered by bandages. It was a tender, moving sight. A single tear rolled down Ryan's cheek, which he had until then kept under control. Max's gentle touch seemed to awaken something in James. Though heavily sedated, the officer slightly moved his fingers, as if trying to respond to the dog's affection. That small reaction was enough to spark hope in Ryan's heart. Watching from a short distance, the doctor noted that this was an excellent sign. Any motor response could indicate the patient was fighting to live. Max stayed by James's side, never leaving for a second. He knew that was where he needed to be. Many hospital staff members were amazed to see a dog in the ICU, but seeing how tenderly and protectively Max stayed beside James, no one dared to interrupt. Some were visibly moved, realizing that under the right circumstances, the bond between human and animal can profoundly affect the recovery of critical patients. Ryan began making frantic phone calls to update the commander on the real situation. He also needed to inform James's family, explain the mix-up and offer all possible support. Meanwhile, word that James was alive spread quickly through the battalion and reached his family members, who were caught in a swirl of emotions. Joy at knowing he was alive, shock at the body swap, and anger at the administrative errors that nearly led them to bury a stranger. Despite this, the priority now was James's recovery. Doctors said he would need multiple reconstructive surgeries and a long period of physical therapy. The full prognosis remained uncertain, given the severity of his injuries. Nonetheless, the fact that James had survived thus far demonstrated a fierce will to live. Time dragged on in that hospital room, but Max showed no signs of fatigue. He understood that James needed him. With every breath or movement, the dog was there, offering company and comfort. His presence calmed not just James, but also everyone who came to visit. Occasionally, a nurse would ask Ryan to take Max out during certain procedures, but whenever possible, the dog returned, standing guard as a loyal friend to the man who had saved him from a dark past. The following days were fraught with uncertainty, tests and intensive treatments. James underwent more surgeries, each carrying significant risks. The medical team fought to contain infections, stabilize his blood pressure, and repair internal damage. Meanwhile, the hospital staff adapted to Max's constant presence, practically treating him as an honorary member of the special care unit. During physical therapy sessions, despite still being very weak, James felt progress, however slight. Healthcare workers noted that when Max was around, James seemed more motivated to attempt new movements, as if the dog's energy alone kept him from giving up. Sometimes when James was awake enough to speak a few words, the first thing he would do was look around for Max, calling his name. It was a challenging period. James's physical pain was compounded by the emotional pain of having been declared dead and realizing what his family and friends had gone through. On the other hand, there was comfort in knowing he still had a chance. In that difficult journey, Max became his main source of support, a companion who required no explanations or justifications, offering only unconditional love. It wasn't long before news of James and Max's story circulated around the hospital and then reached the media. People were moved by the tale of a police dog who sniffed out a mistake at his owner's funeral, forcing them to open a coffin and uncover an unexpected miracle. Reporters began contacting James's family for interviews, and public interest grew. Social media platforms filled with messages of support, and the pair became symbols of hope and resilience. Meanwhile, the police unit continued its daily tasks, but the main topic remained James and Max. Shocked by the incident, the commander ordered an internal investigation to discover how the body identification process could have gone so wrong. He also demanded better communication protocols between the police and local hospitals. Perhaps this tragic error could serve as a wake-up call, preventing future mistakes. Over the following weeks, James made slow but steady progress. Each small improvement was celebrated by everyone who cared for him. During this time of rehabilitation, Max gained a legendary status in the battalion. Every officer, from the newest recruit to the highest-ranking official, saw in the dog a shining example of courage, loyalty, and acute perception. Several police dog trainers began studying Max's behavior, hoping to replicate his training methods and the affectionate bond he shared with James. In lectures and public safety events, there was always one question: how's Max doing? Did he really sense the body wasn't James? The answer invariably came with emotional stories and references to the dog's past achievements. Respect for police dogs within the force grew significantly. It was always known that these animals play a crucial role in fighting crime, but Max and James's story highlighted the human aspect, the emotional bond that can make all the difference in extreme situations. It was a painful but powerful lesson about the importance of valuing every resource at their disposal, including the instincts and sensitivity of a well-trained animal. In internal ceremonies, Max was often honored. He received medals, special collars, and symbolic awards representing the gratitude of the entire force. Yet from Max's perspective, none of that mattered as much as being close to James. At the end of the day, what he wanted was to see his friend recovered, able to walk beside him without machines or crutches. Finally, after months, the day arrived when James was discharged from the hospital. He still needed medical and physical therapy follow-up, but now he could recover at home with his loved ones and his faithful dog. Once again, Max was by his side as James rolled through the hospital's main doors in a wheelchair, applauded by staff, friends, and bystanders moved by the saga. Adjusting to life outside the hospital was no simple task. James struggled to walk and experienced constant pain. He needed help to bathe, eat, and change the dressings over his scars. Some days, frustration overwhelmed him, remembering how he used to chase criminals, participate in high-risk operations, and lead teams, always with Max by his side. Now he could hardly take a few steps without assistance. Even so, James's willpower prevailed. He dedicated himself fully to rehabilitation. He compared his own journey to Max's, who once had been a terrified dog covered in scars, but had managed to rebuild himself through patience and love. If Max could overcome so many barriers, why couldn't James do the same? So every day there they were, James and Max side by side, taking on each challenge. When the physical therapist instructed James to bear his weight on his legs, Max watched attentively, almost as if he were cheering him on. Whenever James took a step with less imbalance, he received enthusiastic licks from the dog, who celebrated each small victory as though it were a trophy. As his recovery progressed, James had to make choices. On medical advice, he could not return to field operations. The risk of worsening his injuries or sustaining new fractures was too great. Recognizing James's value, the commander offered him an administrative position at the battalion, coordinating training programs and units working with police dogs, thus leveraging all the knowledge he had acquired alongside Max. It was the perfect fit. James could still contribute to public safety, now in a more strategic way. Accepting the offer, he brought Max to the new facilities dedicated to training puppies destined for the K9 team. There, the dog became an honorary instructor, mingling with the other dogs, demonstrating through his exemplary behavior how discipline and affection go hand in hand. This initiative yielded extremely positive results. More and more police officers showed interest in understanding the unique bond that James and Max shared. How was it possible to build so much mutual trust? How could past traumas become a source of strength? How could a dog's loyalty go beyond standard protocols and save a life? Emotionally, James recounted his own story to each group of recruits, reminding them that behind every mission are humans and animals who feel fear, joy, and sorrow. Max and James's story transcended police circles. The local community was also captivated by their inspiring journey of recovery. Many children, previously frightened by the presence of police dogs, now saw Max as a hero. Schools began inviting James to give talks on compassion, respect for animals, and the importance of trusting one's instincts. At these events, Max was the star attraction. Children would line up to pet him, listen to stories, and learn about kindness and care toward animals. Adults, meanwhile, were moved by James's quiet confidence. Despite physical scars, he radiated a peaceful determination. He recalled how Max once reacted poorly to loud or unfamiliar settings, yet through persistence became a shining example of triumph. Now it was James's turn to face his fears and physical limits, discovering he could still positively impact countless lives. Over time, Max's name began appearing in studies and reports investigating canine sensitivity. Experts said the dog had a heightened emotional awareness, capable of detecting subtle mood changes in people, as well as identifying wounds or anomalies that humans might miss. Some called it a sixth sense. For James, however, it was living proof that genuine bonds can break through barriers science can't fully explain. Their story also inspired other police dog pairs. Many officers decided to adopt abandoned dogs and train them, hoping to form relationships like the one that saved James's life. In certain districts, dog abandonment rates dropped as the community recognized these animals' potential for friendship and partnership. Within the battalion itself, a hall of honor was created for dogs who died in the line of duty or retired after years of service. Her plaque at the entrance read, "Here we honor heroes without uniforms but with protective souls." Images of Max and James often accompanied the dedication, illustrating the significance of this memorial. Many ceremonies for new recruits now included a moment of silence to honor police dogs, something that never occurred before all the commotion. Though James's routine had changed, challenges continued. Over the years, health problems stemming from his injuries could flare up again. Some days the pain was so intense he had to stay in bed. At those times, Max curled up at his feet watching every move. It was as if the dog understood that this wasn't a day for big adventures, but for rest and patience. Nevertheless, whenever James felt well enough to perform his administrative duties, he did so diligently. Managing paperwork while promoting the K9 program became his main mission. When he longed for fieldwork, he only had to recall the operations that led to his injuries and lengthy surgeries. That chapter was behind him. Now he used his experience to guide younger officers, ensuring they looked after themselves and their canine partners. Max, for his part, slowly grew older. White hairs appeared, particularly around his muzzle. The puppy-like energy was gone, but his eyes still shone whenever he was near James. At some point, the idea of officially retiring Max was suggested so he could rest at home. However, James felt that as long as the dog showed enthusiasm and joy when involved in training, it would be unfair to sideline him. Thus, Max remained active until he reached his own limits. Time is merciless, yet generous to those who find beauty in the journey. James and Max built a legacy that extended beyond the police station and reached the hearts of many in the city. Friends, family, and even strangers were grateful for the example of perseverance they offered. To James, each day with Max was a gift. He never forgot the moment when the dog's barks at the funeral saved him from being buried by mistake. That memory stayed with him in everything he did, reminding him to cherish each moment of life. As for Max, simply being with James was its own reward. Dogs don't harbor resentment or fear of the future. They live intensely in the present, with pure, selfless love. And so, whenever there was a community event, a graduation ceremony for new officers, or a public safety talk, there they were, bringing hope and moving everyone who listened. Children lined up to pet Max, hear stories, and learn lessons of respect and compassion for animals. Adults were impressed by James's calm presence, whose physical scars were overshadowed by a contagious inner peace. We reach here the conclusion of a remarkable journey. James, once presumed dead, found new purpose in life alongside his faithful companion Max. What began as a funeral in mourning transformed into hope when the dog revealed the truth. The bond between man and dog, nurtured over years of partnership and affection, proved capable of overcoming even the shadowy boundary of apparent death. This story reminds us that the power of a heartfelt connection can topple errors, save lives, and inspire countless people. Max didn't just bark that day in the cemetery, he shouted to the world that the truth needed to come out. And thanks to his persistence, James survived and continues to build a legacy of love and awareness. And you, would you have had the courage to open the coffin in that situation? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes intuition and instinct speak louder than words. How many times do we ignore important signs for fear of what others might think? Consider this question as an invitation to reflect. Did you like this story? Subscribe to the channel for more moving stories like this one. If James and Max's story touched your heart, imagine how many more inspiring accounts are out there, waiting to be told. Join a community that values courage, resilience, and the power of love. Leave your like and share so that more people can learn about the incredible bond between humans and animals. Help spread the word. The story of James and Max isn't just about a miraculous rescue, it's about the transformation that takes place when we believe in the potential of those beside us, whether human or animal. Share this seed of hope.